coming. I'm Tim. I'm going to present my dissertation proposal. And this is a talk based on a very long written document. So we're just going to kind of hit the highlights and try and do this, without rushing things, but kind of in a short time frame. So I'd like to start with a poem because I think it's always good to start with a poem. And this is called "The Documents" by Terence Winch. So I'm just going to say a short part of it because it's quite long. So they are the messages that keep coming. They are promises, dreams, hymns, IOUs, proclamations, declarations. They want to tell us who we are and who we should want to be. And Winch wrote this poem in 2014, so just a couple years ago. And what he was hitting on is something that a lot of us have hit on recently, and that is that documents are becoming a bigger and bigger part of human life. Historically speaking, we can probably say that documents have been with us as long as we've been humans, at least very explicitly since the advent of writing. But what makes documents sort of important and very urgent today is that internet and modern communication technologies are creating a lot of document forms that have never kind of been around before, and so we need to reckon with them. And they demand our attention. As a sort of interesting testament to that, just the other day, we got an email from the IT office saying that we're moving our email to a different system, so we need to log into this portal thing to check it and make sure it works. And the homepage tells me that I need to have some documents here and that there aren't any documents to show. And so even when there aren't any documents, it's kind of like, they're wanting to work with us. So a particular kind of document that I've become interested in recently is what I refer to as self-documents. This seems to be something that we need to work with more and more also. And these are documents that we create about ourselves to show certain aspects of ourselves. Here's a couple examples recently from mine, whether it's an email introducing yourself to a person for the first time, or a social media biography in a little short snippet, or a social media feed in itself, all the conglomeration of content that you're sharing, or your CV. But most of all, we have these things called selfies, and I'm sure everyone's familiar with them. All of us have probably taken one in our day. And these are quickly becoming a very strange phenomenon. And they're also being researched in academic research in a number of different fields, from communications to art history to photography, media studies. And a lot of this research, to me, it's sort of missing something. And I think what that is that they're studying who takes selfies and when they take selfies and what they do with them and how they kind of go around and social processes around selfies. But they haven't really explored what a selfie is or what it is that makes a selfie a selfie. The best that they've really done is saying a selfie is a kind of self-portrait, a kind of self-portrait that you take with a smartphone. Okay, well, so we're kind of equating selfie with self-portrait in a number of ways. I'm not sure if that's so simple. So that's part of what was sort of the impetus for this study. Here's an example of a self-portrait. This is Émile Front from 1887. And so, I mean, part of the problem with thinking of selfies as a kind of self-portrait is that we don't really know what a self-portrait even is. The best we can do for that is say, it's the painted likeness of oneself, for example. So if we take this self-portrait, it's more or less clear. It looks pretty straightforward. If we met this guy on the street, where we feel confident that we'd probably be able to recognize him just based on this picture. So, okay, so that's a pretty straightforward example, and we can kind of see the link between this kind of self-portrait and a selfie. But what if we think of this example? This is the last self-portrait that Picasso did in his life. And it really doesn't quite even look like a human. If this was like the police drawing and you were supposed to figure out who robbed the bank, like you would never find this guy. So, if this is a self-portrait and the Friant piece is also a self-portrait, what makes them both a self-portrait? That's also what I'm kind of digging into. So really it's looking at a modern phenomenon and kind of tracing back to its roots is what I'm interested in. And another sort of interesting thing that's coming up lately is when it comes to selfies, we're also seeing a movement towards different abstract ways to take selfies and share selfies and work with them. So this to me seems like a very complex thing that's going on and something that's worth studying. And I think information science brings a particularly interesting perspective to it, and they haven't really been studied too much in information science yet. And that's because we have a long history of working with issues of reference and evidence and relevance. And so I think we could have these could be a really interesting test case for extending theories and working with different theories that we've had. So I've identified a number of research questions, and so I'm just going to present them now, and then I'm going to go through the literature, and they might kind of have a little more context at that point. So my first question is, what sort of a document is a self-portrait? If we're thinking of a self-portrait as a document, what does that mean? Of course, we need to think about what a document is, so that's what I'll talk about in a moment here. The second question is looking at the process of its creation. In document theory, we talk about how the best insight into a document is looking at the processes of its creation. And so here we're moving from the self-portrait as an object to self-portraiture as the process of its creation. After that, I want to look at the lived experience of making a self-portrait, and the reasons for that will hopefully become a little clearer in a bit. But that is this what is it like question. If someone's making a self-portrait, what is that like? What sorts of things are they using to represent themselves in that form? And then fourth, what understanding is built through that process? So information presumably is something epistemic. That means relating to human knowing. And so if we're thinking of self-portraiture as some kind of epistemic process, what does that look like? And this concept of understanding comes up in some of the research on artists' information behavior. And so that's where that comes from here. So I've divided the literature review into 3 sections. First, we'll talk about document and document theory. Second, we'll talk about the information behavior of artists, seeing as self-portraiture is an artistic practice. And then third, we'll talk about understanding as an epistemic aim. So these are I'm sorry, I need to take a drink of water. I've been sick too recently. Okay, so first, document. This is just very broad strokes. This is a concept that comes out of antiquity. There's the Latin verb docere, which means to evince evidence or give an example or provide some kind of proof. And that concept carried forward until the 17th century, when we kind of had a concept of a document as such. And that was sort of around the birth of legal systems and other social systems. Think of things like contracts, marriage contracts, for example. We have seen kind of academic theorization around documents since the late 1800s, and it's kind of continued since then in the fields of bibliography, which gave birth to information science, and it's kind of carried through to today. So we have people like Paul Lay, Suzanne Bray, and recently Michael Buckland, Niels Lunds, and a number of other scholars who have been theorizing documents. I'm not going to go into the historical trajectory just to save time, but let it suffice to say that today we can think of a document as some kind of material evidence which is situated within a referential system. And so a document, it has some kind of physical form. It provides evidence in the sense of, the broad sense of relating to something else or a state of affairs or something in the world. And it's situated in a system, which means it exists alongside other documents and other things. So for example, a book in a library, it's not just a book by itself, but there's all kinds of books, and there's a system of organization around that. And also in the literature on documents, it's been pointed out that documents simultaneously have social, physical, and mental aspects. So next, the research on information behavior of artists. There's actually been some research since the 90s, and this was reviewed by William Hemig in 2008. And so there's been a few studies since then. What overwhelmingly comes out of this is that the focus has been on information seeking, not necessarily use or creation or any of the stuff that comes after seeking, which actually characterizes information behavior research in general. There have been some pretty interesting findings. For example, they've found time and again that artists prefer like a vast variety of all different kinds of works. And this was evidently a surprise to art libraries who said, okay, so we're a library and an art school, so we're going to stock all kinds of books on art technique and art history and artists and whatnot. But it turns out that art students and artists, when they want to use a library, they're looking for like philosophy, like pictures of rainforests, pop music, like all kinds of things. And so that was something unexpected. There was a really interesting study by Sandra Cohen, which is the second chunk here. And she did a case study with one particular artist doing a piece of work and investigated the information sources that this artist used while she was working. And it turned out that the artist worked with the environment. The work itself became an information source and sort of like a feedback loop as the artist was working. The artist also drew information from relationships she had with other artists, with other works of her own, with other artists' works, in sort of a very sort of web going outwards. And then also self-inquiry and attentiveness were also information sources for this artist. So this work by Cohen is one of the pieces that I want to build on most directly in my research. To me, perhaps the most interesting thing she found was that artists, when they're working, they're seeking understanding. And this sort of not clashes, but it's a little different nuance than the typical orientation we take in information behavior, which says, okay, somebody has, say, an anomalous state of knowledge, or they don't know something, so they seek information to address that, they get the information, then they're good. Rather, Cohen kind of characterized this artist as engaging joyfully with the world. It wasn't a sense of being a problematic situation that needs to be solved. So this thing about understanding really interested me, and so that's what motivated the research into understanding. Incidentally, this has also become a topic of interest in information science, even outside work with artists, chiefly through the work of David Bowden, who's talked about how we work with documents to build understanding, and how perhaps understanding is a more interesting epistemic aim than knowledge per se, or information when you're talking about documents. And that's because it allows for shades of gradation. Like you can have kind of degrees of understanding rather than like, yes, you know it, or no, you don't know it. And this has also been a topic of recent philosophical interest in what I call mainstream epistemology, but really it's like American Anglo epistemology since like the 70s or so. What's really interesting to me is that this kind of might take us a little bit afield, but historically speaking, epistemology comes from the study of episteme, which is this Greek concept, which we usually translate as knowledge only. But recently they've kind of been doing some digging and realized that we can also translate this as understanding. And so suddenly a lot of disagreements from epistemology all over the 20th century kind of are getting cleared up when we can think of some things as knowledge and some things as understanding. So that's sort of an aside, but it's just interesting to me how understanding is becoming really a really groundbreaking and important concept. In information science, we've kind of approached understanding a little bit from two different angles. One is hermeneutic phenomenology, which is this philosophy started by Heidegger in the early 20th century, adapted by Gadamer. And so that's kind of found its way into a few corners of information science. And that's one type of understanding. But then the kind that Bowden and the epistemologists are talking about is a different kind of understanding. And there's been some talk about how these are, irreconcilable, they're mutually irrelevant, whatever. And so I was kind of thinking if I could bring them together a little bit. And so I've come up with this framework of ontological understanding and ontic understanding. And without getting too in the weeds on this, I think it's easy just to think about ontological understanding as this background that happens in human being. You're going about, it's how your mind works. It's how you kind of make sense of things as you move about in the world. And then ontic understanding you could call them the specific understandings about, this is how the solar system works. So this is an understanding of the solar system. But it's your ontological understanding that allowed you to reach that. Yeah, and then recently Bowden and his colleague Lynn Robinson have been kind of writing a few more papers on understanding. And one of the things that they point out why it's particularly useful for LIS to talk about understanding is that there's this general idea, that's a silly thing to say, but this idea that, for something to qualify as knowledge, it has to be true, right? Factual, correct, true. But libraries, for example, are full of all sorts of things that aren't true. Either it's, outdated stuff. Maybe it's like, Ptolemy's theory of how the solar system works, say. Or what about fiction? Things that aren't accessible as true or false necessarily. But these things, even though they're not, knowledge per se, they can contribute to understanding. And so if we kind of shift from knowledge to understanding, that allows us to account for a lot of different information items and things that our collections have. So out of all this research that I've reviewed, I identified a number of key opportunities. So the first thing, and they're sort of all very related. So the first thing is to look at the mental aspects of the document. Time and again, like I said before, documents have social, physical, and mental aspects. Time and again, it's been pointed out that we have really strong research on the physical and the social aspects, but people haven't been looking at the mental aspects. And so if you think of a document as something that provides evidence, we can conceptualize this mental, quote unquote, mental aspects as how evidence happens. How is it that something can function as evidence? And so this kind of brings in conversations of relevance and that sort of thing. Second is to look at information experience. There was a book by Bruce and her colleagues that came out in 2014, kind of like bringing together a number of perspectives on information experience. And the consensus is that we need to learn more about it. It's not enough to just say this information, this, whatever this piece of paper contains this information, give it to you and you have the information. There's some cognitive processes, emotional processes that go on when somebody gets informed that are worth exploring. Next, going back to the understanding thing, if people are working with information and building some sort of understanding, well, we need to understand those processes a little more deeply also. Going back to the work on artist information behavior, as I said, there's been almost exclusive focus except for the work of Cohen, and then one study by Tanya Tidline. It's almost only looked at artist information seeking, so we could use some more work on creation and use, and what happens after seeking, or to support seeking, and then also to apply document theory to artist information behavior. Document theory has kind of been its own thing a lot. We've seen some overlap with information behavior generally, which is nice. I tend to like synthesis and things. But the talk on artist information behavior has completely been separate from document theory, so I see some opportunities to bring those together. And I contend that this can be done in a study of self-portraiture, conceptualized as a kind of documentation. So revisiting the research questions, as I said, we're going to look at the nature of self-portraits as a kind of document, the process of their creation, then looking into the experience of what it's like to create a self-portrait and what kind of understandings are built therein. And I break these into the first two questions can be addressed conceptually, and the second two questions empirically. So I'm going to talk about the methods, but first we must start at the bottom. Methods always are informed by an overarching methodology, and then also you can think of it as meta theory. So a meta theory is sort of the guiding philosophy that underlies a methodology. Methodology is a little more specific philosophic framework that sort of opens and closes certain possibilities for a work. And then the methods are the specific, I'm talking to these people about this, doing this kind of analysis. So to start with meta theory, as I kind of alluded to earlier, my study is rooted in chiefly the work of Heidegger and hermeneutic phenomenology. And this is an interpretative way to describe things, basically. I like to think of it, hermeneutic phenomenology, as trying to understand the way that we understand things before we try to understand them. So the idea is that we come to the world with some kind of pre-understanding. I mean, I recognize this as a water bottle before I think about whether it's a water bottle. And so phenomenology tries to get at what is it that made me see it as a water bottle in the first place. And then another meta theory that I'm working with, using it as a meta theory, even though it can also be used as a methodology, is arts-informed research. This is a type of arts-related research, which has kind of been bubbling up since the early aughts. And it looks at different ways that we can bring artistic practice and academic research together. Arts-informed research is specifically informed by arts, but it's not, it's contrasted with, for example, arts-based research. Basically, it recognizes that artistic practice can be knowledge-generating in some way, and it seeks to kind of bring that into academia and see, what mutual learnings can occur. One of the really big values of arts-informed research, which I'm going to harness in my study, is that it emphasizes accessibility. It doesn't want research to be, blocked up in arcane language, in journals behind paywalls. It wants the learnings that we get from doing research to be out in the world. So that's something I'm going to do in my study, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So next, the specific methodology that I'm going to use, it's called phenomenology of practice. It was developed over the past 25 years or so by Max von Manen. And this is a way of approaching phenomenology that's at once philosophical and empirical. What it does is it analyzes examples of lived experiences, and it seeks to explore the what is it like question. It's also been said that phenomenology of practice, or even hermeneutic phenomenology in general, is a study of understanding, and so it's very well suited to my questions of understanding and what self-portraiture is like. One of the other things that really appeals to me about this methodology is that von Manen talks about it as a method for questioning. Now, answers are very nice, and we all like answers, but there's something about answers that kind of feels final, or like, end of story. But to me, when a study, for example, or when something can generate further questions, that's really exciting. So one of the explicit aims of phenomenology of practice is to generate more questions, not out of like skepticism or dubiousness, but out of inspiration, really, or excitement. So that's something that will hopefully, that's a gauge for seeing whether the study was done well, is if it generates more questions. So, like I said, the first two questions will be addressed conceptually, the second two questions empirically, all within a framework of phenomenology of practice. The conceptual methods, now this, again, we have this ontic-ontological distinction, which necessitates a little Heideggerianism, but we can just kind of let it sit with this, that I'll start with sort of a literature review of both popular and scholarly works on selfies and self-portraits and related concepts, to see how they're understood, how they're talked about in more sociologically oriented fields. And then from there, once we have what Heidegger would refer to as like a surface level grasp of the multi variegated phenomenon of self-portraits, we could dig into its essence. And so that's where the ontological analysis comes in. And so there's some tools, is like etymological analysis, so looking at word origins. The idea is that if you can think about how the word was used when it was, when it came into language, so in this case it would be German and French, that might give you some insight into how it was experienced by people before we kind of started taking it for granted as like a straightforward representation of somebody. So that's one avenue to kind of generate some insights. Next, and perhaps more like structurally rigorous, is this reductive analysis. Now this word isn't reductive in the sense of like reductionism or numerically reducing. It comes from the Latin verb reducere, which means going back to. So once I've got these insights from the ontic analysis and the etymological analysis, we can go back to document theory, philosophy of art, philosophy of information, and kind of see how these things hold together, whether they challenge each other, whether they kind of fit together. So that's called a reductive analysis. Then after that, we'll have sort of a decent sense, hopefully, of the first two research questions. What is a self-portrait and what is self-portraiture, considered as document and documentation? And then we'll move into the empirical methods. And so this will involve the collection and analysis of some different examples of self-portraiture. So I'm working on recruiting local artists to create a piece, and they'll track their progress as they make it. So they'll work in a number of work sessions. At the end of each work session, they'll answer a protocol, and they'll take pictures of their piece in progress. And then once they finish the piece, there will be a semi-structured interview to kind of get more detail on things that weren't clear, to ask further questions. This also gives them an opportunity to reflect on the process, to give kind of two aspects to it. So the in-progress stuff would be as it's happening, and then the second piece could be thought of what's called a hermeneutic interview, which gets at their kind of reflection. And so it gives the researcher and the participant a chance to kind of reflect in concert. So in the literature on this, it's been said that the number 3 to 6 participants is kind of the ideal for a study that you can go into very deep depth, go in depth in what you're seeing. I've decided to recruit up to 10 because I'm assuming there will be some attrition, but we'll see. This kind of study is tenable with even one person, but of course you can kind of get more insights with more participants. But I think over 10 would be kind of untenable just from a logistics and to be able to do justice to each participant. So kind of going in the range from 1 to 10. So we'll see what happens. I'll mention a little later, but I've got 8 participants enrolled so far. So once you've got this material, each self-portrait becomes it's called an example in this methodology. It becomes an example unto itself. And so those are they're analyzed inductively through multiple rounds of open coding. And for some structure, I'm drawing from the Miles and Huberman text to code for processes, emotions, and descriptions. And through a few rounds of coding, these will develop into themes. And the ultimate results will be structured as narratives, which is basically standard in phenomenology of practice and also a number of other anthropological type research fields, and even it's getting more accepted in the social sciences. And also poetic displays, which is a technique in, I don't think this was in the older Miles and Huberman texts, but in the 2014 edition, it's a really interesting technique, which basically is a way to distill this whole narrative into a small poem, which tries to capture the essence of the experience without, kind of eviscerating it. So next, any study should be, we should think of how rigorous it is and how we can think about its rigor. So I'm just going to take a moment to talk about quality in a study like this. So when we're assessing rigor, we have these 3 kind of cardinal terms: generalizability, validity, and reliability. These are often discussed in quantitative methods, but they can also kind of be transported into the qualitative world. So first, to talk about generalizability. When we hear that word, we generally assume that we're talking about statistical generalizability, which means I've done some study on a small sample and I'm going to mathematically extrapolate to a population, whatever that may be. In this case, I'm going for analytical generalizability, which is a concept I got from Robert Ginn's case study research. It's sometimes called transferability under some researchers. And basically the idea is you're not like blindly mathematically applying your findings to a whole population. Rather, you're going to consider the findings. In this study, it may be just one example, or maybe some of my more general findings. and considering a new case one at a time and really thinking about how that applies or doesn't apply and how those findings could be relevant or are challenged by a different case. So it's really a more active process rather than a passive one. And Yin talks about ways to strengthen the analytical generalizability of a study. And one of the ways he says is deep description of the context and the methods for data collection. So next, validity. In qualitative research, this is generally conceptualized as trustworthiness or verisimilitude. So whether the researcher and the methods are trusted, whether the result is something that sort of has a lifelikeness to it. And some of the ways to improve the validity of a study are, again, being transparent in the method, using multiple forms of data, memoing throughout the process to get a deeper sense of the researcher's own perspective on things and how that might come into play in interpretation. Another good term in phenomenological research is this idea of the phenomenological nod. Basically, it's that if I give my findings to an artist or someone who's done a self-portrait, or even anybody to some extent, and they read it and they find themselves nodding along, that's a good sign. It means something in the work was resonant with them, and there was some, kernel of what you would call like lived truth or whatnot. Third, reliability. This is a question of whether, if you do it again, if you would get the same or at least very similar kind of results, or at least not contradictory. It's questionable, this idea of reliability in qualitative methods in general, but we still have it. So just some of the ways that I've thought about reliability in my study is that I've practiced this methodology, literally these exact methods on myself, which I'll talk about in a minute. But also I've used phenomenology of practice in other studies of my own, so I feel comfortable with it. Kirsten has used a similar methodology, and so she'll be able to help me work with it. And then also I'll have multiple participants, and so if I'm seeing like, each participant is just very starkly different, that could be a sign that something is weird with the reliability of this study. So that'll be an opportunity to check for that. So as I just mentioned, I have done a preliminary foray into this area using myself as the research participant, and this was done for a number of reasons. The first was to fine-tune my methods and see, like, if any question wasn't quite getting the answers I wanted, if any question was utterly useless, if I needed to ask new things, and also to build rapport with my participants. In arts-informed research, and even any kind of research seeking some kind of tacit knowledge dimension, it's really important to have a shared sense of purpose with the participants. And so this was a way for me to build that, because as I'm recruiting them and explaining to them the methods that they'll do, I can say, yeah, I did this when I did this. I found this question to be repetitive or whatever. So just embrace the repetitiveness, for example. And lastly, this sort of preliminary study was a way to present some initial explorations and kind of direct my inquiry further. So this took the form of a prose narrative, which is quite long, and I'm not going to it here, and also a poetic display. So I'll just share this little excerpt from the poem and also some of the visuals. So it was a very interesting process, actually. If I can reflect on the preliminary findings a little bit, there were three areas that came up. One of them was that self-portraiture is sort of this odd combination of mundane and magicalness. On one hand, it's like a series of technical steps, and it's very boring. And I had to put on an audiobook or a podcast just like to keep my mind intact. But it's also sort of surprising. Accidents happen, and they can kind of inform the piece, like the direction of the piece. Like I might make a mark by accident and kind of roll with it. So I think that's what Cohen was getting at when she characterized the artwork itself as an information source. So I noticed that in myself too. Next interesting thing is that self-portraiture, for me at least, was integrated within the fabric of my life. It wasn't like, now I'm going to go over to this other realm and do a self-portrait. It was like, I had one sort of episode where I was sleeping and I woke up in the middle of the night and I was somehow thinking about the self-portrait, and I was like, oh yeah, I need to change my nose. Like, and so that very weird thing. So I'm sort of seeing a challenge in the boundaries of self-portraiture, if you want to say it that way. And then thinking a little bit about the understandings that were built in this process, things about my technical abilities, for example, not having done any kind of art for a long time, thinking about money for whatever reason, see, like it's seemingly completely irrelevant, but, and my life path. So I'm gonna do this study with more participants and see how they challenge and extend what I found in myself and get more nuance, hopefully we have some more richness in there. So I'm just looking forward to the kind of things that we might discuss based on what I find after doing the full study. One thing that might come out of it is a model for self-documentation. I use model very loosely. Maybe it's a set of themes. Maybe it's more of just a small framework. But what can we say about self-documentation based on this? Maybe not that much, because this is sort of idiosyncratic, but maybe we can get something started. Next, how we can contribute to the literature I talked about in artist information behavior, in document theory, in understanding. Third, I talked about how my results might challenge or be extended by the ones with my participants, but also I want to look at how the conceptual and the empirical results can kind of work with each other, or maybe they don't, and that could be interesting too. Other things I'm going to be attuned to is looking for differences in terms of demographic dimensions, basically, whether it's the age of the person, whether they're students or professionals, hobbyists and whatnot. I'll talk about that a little more in a minute. And also I'm curious to think about how tracking the process changed the process, which is the case in any kind of research, but perhaps, I mean, surely also here, where they have to kind of, there's another element to their work session. So I'll be curious to learn about that. And based on this research, you might be thinking, this is very dumb. What are we going to get out of this? So I thought a little bit about what kind of contribution I can make. I've become very interested in the philosophical work of Luciano Floridi in the philosophy and ethics of information. And he talks about, a number of other researchers have brought this up too, but we're moving to this stage that he calls on life, where there is no longer a distinction between online and offline. We're conceptualizing our existence in terms of information, and we kind of see information everywhere. And so in this climate, with technologies that are emerging, I think it's really important to brush with these ideas of what is it like to deal with information, especially when it comes to self-documentation. And moving forward from that, I want to think about how can self-documentation lead towards a good life. It can certainly lead towards a vapid life, possibly, if we want to be sort of cynical about it. But what ethical implications can we have from learning about self-documentation? Another interesting area is learning more legitimizing pathic knowledge. Van Manen and a number of other scholars talk about not knowledge in the sense of processes and cognitive and knowing knowledge, but in the sense of felt meanings and kind of more intuitive knowledge, what's called inceptual in the Heideggerian vernacular. Another aspect is this civic discussion. Like I mentioned before, arts-informed research really wants to be out of the ivory tower. And so I'm going to create an online website with the artist's works. And also I've been working with the Drexel collection, and it seems like it's a go, but I'm waiting for the final confirmation that we'll have an exhibition on campus, and that'll be in the main building next year, April through June. So that'll give a chance for these works to kind of be publicly shown, but also with signage, with my findings, and give your average random Drexel student a chance to reflect on these kind of topics, which I think is interesting and important. And thinking even further, I want to think about what these findings might mean for design. Designing for self-documentation. We have things like Snapchat and whatnot, but what might these contribute to those design conversations? Lastly, just to talk a little bit about feasibility and timeline. This isn't just coming out of nowhere. I try not to reference them for a number of reasons, but I have a number of works that conceptually contribute to this. So it's a thread that I've been following for a while, and in that has been peer reviewers' comments, which help lead me to other literatures, talking to a number of people over the past few years, and also I have a number of great mentors, including people in this room, to help me do it. So in terms of logistics, as I mentioned before, I've recruited 8 participants so far. They're a really broad range. One is an 18-year-old girl who just started art school. One is a woman in her 60s who's kind of been a hobbyist artist for her whole life. I have MFA graduates. I have people who are working full-time in an office job but do art on the side kind of thing. So it's a really interesting collection. And also in terms of methods, media, some painters. I have a stained glass artist, sculpture artist, so abstract expressionist. So it's going to be a really interesting set of projects, I think. So just to think about the timeline, between now and September, I'm going to continue collecting examples. Like I said, I have 8 participants. Some of them have already begun working, so I'm collecting their examples. That will continue through September, which is their deadline. And meanwhile, I'll be doing the conceptual aspects of this work. Then from September to January, I'll be analyzing the examples, the empirical examples, and writing. and that'll be kind of an ongoing process. I expect January to June being like draft revisions and things like that. Like I mentioned before, April to June will be hopefully this exhibition of artworks. If it can't happen on campus, then I'm going to pursue it somewhere else. And then the plan is to defend this dissertation next year, June. So that's all. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim.
Thank you.